Hey, welcome everybody to the next installment of AI and the Law. I'm Bo Howell here, your host, and we're talking about the penetration of AI into the legal community. This week's discussion is kind of on the fundamentals. We're going to get into some definitions and a short discussion on the basics of AI. Let's dive into it, shall we? All right, so the first definition we need to put out there is algorithm, right? What is an algorithm? Algorithm is basically a set of instructions. It's kind of like a computer recipe, right? The set of code, instructions that somebody writes to tell a computer to do something specific. So it's very basic, kind of the fundamental building block. If for lawyers, if you're thinking about it, it's a sentence, right? The next thing we want to talk about is what is AI bias, okay? So we've built some type of application, some type of large language model or other AI tool, and we've provided a training set, okay? The training set is your initial data that you're using in order to train the model, view its output, and find out is it performing the way you hoped it performed, right? So you put your training set in. But this is where we can see AI bias. So one of the things that you'll hear a lot about is tools such as ChatGPT have basically been trained on the internet, right? Which sounds great. The internet has a ton of information out there from all over the world. The reality is a lot of that information has biases in it. So a lot of it is written by people in developed countries, so specific cultures. So you may have overrepresentation of certain cultures such as the United States, Western Europe, China, on the internet, and other cultures are underrepresented, right? So maybe cultures in Africa, Latin America, other areas where we can see AI bias come up from the training set if we use the internet is in race. I think something like 70% of all images on the internet are of people that are white, just plain and simple, right? So if you're doing image recognition or things like that, or you're trying to build a tool to help you generate images, the training set, what it's been taught is, hey, while there are people of different color, different races, most people are white. So that's going to kind of be our default, right? So that's a bias we have to watch out for. The other bias that we see is language. So almost the vast majority of the information on the internet is in English. And while AI can be used to translate, if a lot of the training set is in English, that has potential for creating biases too. Other areas where we could see biases come into play are things like disability. I had a great discussion with somebody today about how a lot of these tools are not really designed for people with disabilities, whether it's people with vision disabilities or hearing, things like that. And so some of that training set may introduce biases that are the adoption of these technologies with people with certain disabilities. So those are biases that we need to think about, and it usually appears in the training data, right? So if you're building an application and you find that a lot of the output is not what you would expect or seems to be exhibiting improper, harmful behavior or something like that, you might need to go back and look at the data set, right? Because that's where we can find a lot of these biases. So let's talk a little bit about some of the specific tools. Again, getting into terminology here. What is a chatbot? A chatbot is a type of AI system, right? But it's pretty basic. Chatbots have kind of simple algorithms behind them that allow them to do, for the most part, kind of linear or decision tree type tasks, okay? So they might be able to do things like establish preliminary steps in a project, schedule appointments, look through your calendar, maybe do some basic responses based on responses that have been put into its database. But these aren't really generative technologies, right? They don't produce content on their own. They don't really have the ability to kind of necessarily look through patterns outside of their specific set of instructions, unlike a neural or deep network might. So when we talk about things like ChatGPT, we're talking about generative AI. So what are these things? How are they trained? Well, these are different types of AI systems, such as large language models, neural networks, things like that can do what people refer to as deep learning. They're kind of a black box, right? When we set these models up, we don't get really specific into the type of output we want, right? The idea here is it's almost like kind of educating a child, right? You'll teach them certain things by showing them your training set, and from that training set, these networks can start to identify patterns. A lot of times those patterns are based on syntax, which is why we see them a lot in natural language processing. And what they're really looking for is you're going to feed in all this data and you're going to train the model to guess the next best word based on your query, right? So what it does, these things don't really have the ability to kind of think beyond the next word. They look at patterns and they start to kind of add words, but they can do it at super speed. So That's why it seems like it comes out and it's conversational, right? All it's doing is guessing the next best word. It doesn't have the ability to have logic. If you give it some context and prompting, that can help it to identify the patterns that it wants to follow when it comes to guessing that word. But that's essentially how these things are working. So ChatGPT is just a type of model, generative AI model that is trained to basically guess the next best response. The problem is, what a lot of people talk about is like, well, we're supposed to know, if we want to deploy some of these tools, we're supposed to know how they work. But that goes against the fundamental design of these tools. These tools are designed to be a bit of a black box, right? And the reason why we do that is because we're not trying to manipulate the output. We're trying to see what does it come up with on its own. One of the things I've been thinking about is this may be like if you're used to working with young children, maybe they've learned certain patterns and schedules based on their daily life, right? They get up, they have breakfast, they do some certain tasks, right, that you've taught them to do before. And you've taught them by showing them, and they repeat it over and over again until they start to kind of learn the pattern. But what happens when that child is faced with a new task, maybe something they've never done before? The way that humans often approach it is through analogy, right? Like, well, I haven't done this before, but I've done something kind of similar, so I'm going to apply the same process to do that other task on this one. And that's essentially what generative AI does, right? It looks for patterns that it's seen before, and it takes what it knows about those patterns to guess what it should do for your specific prompt. So what is deep learning? These generative AI models use a type of deep learning, which is a subset of machine learning, right? So if you've seen the Venn diagram where AI is the big circle, within the big circle is a smaller circle of machine learning, deep learning is an even smaller subset of machine learning. So it uses very complex algorithms, very complex sets of instructions to analyze information based on its training set. So in the case of the law, we may set up like a neural network and then feed it lots of legal documents, whether it's court cases or contracts, transactional documents, and we might even feed it non-legal stuff, right? Maybe blogs or things that talk about the law but aren't necessarily legal precedent, right? They're not necessarily legal work product. So we might feed some of that into this machine that's going to go through deep learning, and this deep learning machine will kind of look for these patterns and sift over time. Again, it's a bit of a black box. We don't necessarily know how they work. We don't always know what their capabilities are. So one of the interesting things about these kind of complex generative AI models, these deep learning models, is this idea of emergent traits, which is, there's a debate whether these things actually, emergent traits exist. But the idea is as you make these models more and more complex, they may start to exhibit behaviors that you didn't expect. Because again, maybe that wasn't the purpose. It wasn't the purpose of the training set, or it was just something not on your radar. And then all of a sudden, you built this model, you start running it iteration over iteration over iteration. It goes from doing ABC, which you expected, it's doing basic logic, mathematics skills, the ability to pass the bar. When we look at like ChatGPT and we look at versions 1, 2, and 3, couldn't pass the bar. The more that they experience life, the more things they do, the more tasks they're assigned to, the more education they go through, their capabilities grow and grow, and it might grow in ways that we didn't expect. When we talk about generative AI, that's a very specific type of application. So the idea is it's going to create new content based on existing content that's been fed into its training set, right? Imagine that you've got a contract. Let's say it's a type of contract it's never written before, but it's seen thousands of other contracts, and you ask it to produce this contract. Now all of a sudden it can produce a new type of contract, or provisions that maybe it hasn't seen before, but based on the tens of thousands of other data points, it has an idea for what we might want. And this is where we get into hallucinations, right? So a hallucination isn't the machine trying to lie to you. It's not trying to be manipulative. It's not trying to confuse you or fool you. Hallucination is just when it makes a wrong guess, right? This is, again, it's guessing the next best output, the next best word, and it just guesses wrong. And there's no intent behind it. It's not like the machines are evil and they're trying to, lie to us. They have no knowledge of truth. They just guess wrong. And that's what really a hallucination is. It's a bad guess, which is why we always have to double check AI. So if we get into some other topics here, large language models, again, large circle AI, smaller circle machine learning, smaller circles, deep learning and large language language model is a smaller circle. So it's a subset. It's really the engine behind a lot of these generative AIs, which are essentially based on natural language processing, right? So they're trained on huge amounts of text data that's on the internet today that was written by people and is easily understandable by the machine, gets fed in. All of a sudden it can start to produce output, whether it's legal research, document mail generation, things like that. So deep learning is a subset of machine learning. Machine learning, like we talked about, is a subset of AI. It's where the machines are learning without any specific programming. They're not being groomed, right? And so this is kind of the black box concept. When it comes to machine learning, is we're just building the black box. We're shoving in a bunch of data and we're waiting to see what happens, right? And then depending on what happens, we can adjust the training set. We got to be very careful that we don't adjust the front end of the algorithm, the model, to try and influence or manipulate it. And that's intentional because we want to see what it's capable. All of a sudden, if you start influencing it too much, well, now you're just really building an application and telling it what to do, building a more simplified algorithm, maybe chain of algorithms that could do complex tasks, but they're designed to do a specific thing or set of things, right? So we start to limit the capabilities of the model. Another terminology we want to get used to is natural language processing. Again, subset of artificial intelligence, subset of large language models. And this is just using natural human language for training the application, producing output. Natural language processing will be used in like text generation, but not image generation, right? Because an image is not necessarily a language. Because at the end of the day, lawyers for the most part we're writers. We do a lot of writing. Everything's written on documents. That's what we focus on. It's almost like if it doesn't exist in writing, it's maybe not valid, right? How many times have you had a phone call with a client and you follow up with an email, put it in writing? Phone call with opposing counsel, follow up with an email, because trust what's in the written record, and all that's being used to build out these natural language processing. And then finally, we talked a lot about training data. Training data is probably the most crucial impact to teaching and developing AI. The quality of that data is very important. The diversity of that data is very important, because again, without the diversity of data, we can create a lot of biases. If we have poor quality data, it's going to affect the quality of our output. So garbage in, garbage out. That's a saying we're all very familiar with. And so the training data is super important. One of the interesting conversations going on now is we've had this acceleration in the growth of generative AI and AI applications that have been trained on the internet. Now we're starting to see some of the people who created that information, writers, authors, musicians, even journalists, trying to enforce their intellectual property rights and basically going after some of these AI companies and said, hey, you used our work product to develop your tool, which you're now financially benefiting from. You didn't pay us for that work. You didn't pay us for the rights to use that data, even though it was available on the internet. You need to now. And so the question is, if all of a sudden intellectual property rights become enforced and data becomes either more expensive to get or harder to get, are we going to see a slowdown in the development of these AI models? And the expectation is yes, right? Kind of the golden age of AI development is over. Whether right or wrong, free access to a ton of information on the internet. And as the internet gets gated, as information has to be purchased or acquired, it'll be harder to get, it'll be more limited, it may become less diverse, which could create more bias issues. But that's the world we're in today. So training data is super important, probably one of the biggest things to pay attention to in the next 5 years as we watch to see how AI is going to develop. Next week, we're going to be talking about specific instances of AI use in law practice. This is where I could use your help. So if you are a lawyer or professional in the legal industry, even if you're a developer, I'd love to hear about the types of tools that you're building. Please leave a comment, reach out to me. If you've got demos, images, graphics you'd like to share, I'd really like to start promoting some of the ways that AI is being used within the legal industry. And I think this will be a good time once we get that one out to do a follow-up kind of Q&A session and have a live session where lawyers can get together and discuss some of these things. So be on the lookout for next week's article and video on AI use in the law specifically, and our follow-up Q&A. If you like the content, subscribe. If you have any questions or suggestions, please leave them below. And as always, keep innovating. Thanks.